Uh, I'm Smriti Jaiswal, an observer at LSPR, and with me is Nidhi Agrawal, the editor at LSPR. Today we are hosting a podcast for our queer column, and we have with us Professor Dr. Niharika Banerjea. She is a professor in Gender Global Law School, and she is honorary visiting fellow at the School of Geography, Geology, and Environment, University of Leicester. She has been writing about transdisciplinary queer gender sexuality studies, and she has a lot of academic works which have been there, which have written about the queer community and how it interacts with the society, how it interacts with the law. And today, in our discussion, we will be going ahead with discussing about her recently published book, which is Livable Lives, and along with it we'll be having a general discussion about the queer community and how it like interacts with law and society.
Thank you, Smriti. Just starting off from there, ma'am. Uh, just would you like to give us a brief intro about your book, and if Smriti has missed anything about yourself as well?
No. um, Introductions are always, always um, difficult for the person who's introducing. So thank you for inviting me to this. It's good to interact with both of you and anybody else who will be listening to this. So this book is a result of a long conversation between colleagues in the academia and in the activist world, namely Professor Kath Brown at the University College Dublin and we were the primary investigators of this work, and we did this with academic, with activists in England, in the UK mostly, and in Calcutta with members of Sappho for Equality. So that what I'm talking about now is part of is a project that we began in 2014, and then the project ended a few years back. But given the paucity of time and other commitments, it's only now that we were able to work on the book the last year and bring it out this year. So this started as a conversation between Kath and me, where and that at that time, 377 was in place. And it started as a conversation between both of us, where we were thinking that there are these very real progress and backward narratives that exist in the world, where those nations which are supposed to have laws, affirmative action laws for LGBTQ identifying persons, they are supposed to be, in the progress scale, and those people identifying as LGBTQ in places where there aren't, affirmative action legal protections, they are identified as being in the backward scale. And who does this identification? Mostly, states of nations, as well as, international funding organizations and development institutions, global development institutions, so much so that, often development aid is decided on the basis of which nation is further ahead in the quote unquote homophobia index based on, legal reforms, and which nation is quote unquote backward. So this is something that we were, having a conversation about, and we found very troubling. And so we decided that let's actually, speak to people and see and kind of test this on the ground, fully well knowing from our own contexts and histories that social groups, who are within the quote unquote gender sexual minorities, they necessarily do not consider themselves as backward if they are living in places where they have legal reforms, and social groups who are consider themselves as gender sexual minorities do not consider themselves necessarily as forward when, if they're living in places that have, legal reforms. So this was the starting point of the work. And the book took a long time. We have published some articles in between, but this book took a long time to come out, given our different kinds of commitments. So that was the basis of the book, and this is what the book is about.
So I was going through the book, and I really liked how you have changed. I think you mentioned this in chapter one of your book, livable to livable, taken from Judith Butler, interpret it on your own. Do you want to shed some light on how Judith Butler's work kind of inspired you to start this entire of what livability actually means?
Yeah, I mean, when we started this, this conversation, we kind of, fell back on the concept of livability, because we found it useful to, see, how our lives lived in situations where legal reform, is not there, and where legal reforms are there. So this was, the broad question, and we found the concept of livability to be useful. Livability in basically Judith Butler's work, and one of the reasons why we found it useful is because, the other kinds of terms that were there, like exclusion, inclusion, so which country includes LGBTQ identifying people, which country excludes them. So this language of exclusion and inclusion, we felt was very much tied to the question of who has rights and who does not. And so therefore, it was again within a very juridico-political framework. And we were thinking that we were interested in people's lives, what they were thinking, what they were saying. And many of these people are our, from our own communities, our friends, our kins, our friends of friends, and, also people whom we do not know. So there was a very intimate connection to this question as well. And so we thought that, livability as a tool, as a conceptual tool, would help us to move beyond the, in easy discourse of rights, and which is tied to juridico political equalities of, gender sexual forms of living. So therefore, we really went to this concept of livability, and so our conceptual debt lies there to Judith Butler's work, who articulates, livability in several of their works, and it basically, Butler's understanding of livability is connected to her concerns about precariousness, questions of precarity, vulnerability, grievability, and so on. And so we found that, we thought that this would be a very useful concept, which is not necessarily only related to gender sexual minorities, but it could be useful in addressing our question, because it would directly take us to forms of living and how do people lead their lives, thereby shattering the binary understanding of progress and backward nation states.
Right. Thank you for that. Just
But I
following
have
up
to
on
say
that.
this, that, when you start any kind of work, you hold on, you use a certain kind of concept to help answer your question, but it's always important to remember that it is never exhaustive. When you know, because we use this concept doesn't mean that it is completely seal proof, because the book has come out very recently, and we are going through it. If I were to do this work today, then I would again put many more things in it, and so on. So it's never it's never a closed subject that way.
Thank you, Professor. Uh, just one more thing I found particularly interesting about your book was in chapter 3, where you talk about these alleged stakeholders during the 377 debates and how their reactions were to the judgment actually coming out, where they felt that it was kind of a dark mark on the Indian history or the Indian judicial history because 377 should not have been struck down. But if you see the discourse of the court, it's not very different. How they try to rationalize it as well is by including queer identities and queer discourses within the Indian national framework or Indian nationalism framework per se, where their idea is going back to Indian history and saying that, oh, we have had a great history where queer identities were present, and this is not something Western that is being imposed on us. So, do you
Mhm.
think a form of nationalist discourse is being undertaken even by the judiciary to uh, assimilatize the queer identities within the Indian national framework, or are we trying to impose something on ourselves which wasn't particularly quote unquote Indian in the start?
Yeah, this is a question that is that is changing. The answer of which is changing every time we speak, because so if we are starting from the question of nationalist discourse, the nationalist discourse is also not one homogeneous thing. So it has also changed, as and when as in when during different historical political contexts. So, for example, the current government has had very shifting stance towards the LGBTQ population, LGBTQIA plus population. And so, therefore, we have seen that in our context, the current government has been extremely opposed to including the LGBTQIA subject within its nationalist discourse, to becoming very, having a dynamic option. So you will find, different persons during different points in time within the larger political party making some concessions, again, depending on, whether the person is trans or whether the person is L, or L identifying, and so on and so forth. So it's very tricky, because it's hard to say that there is a wholesome incorporation of the figure into the nationalist discourse. It has definitely shifted from being directly opposed to becoming more quote unquote tolerant, and therefore by either directly saying that we choose to keep our distance, they can do whatever they want, or by directly but by just keeping silence when, let's say, 377 was read down and so on. But at other times, when there are laws that are directly not associated with the queer subject or with the trans subject, there are laws like against which persecute trans persons who are on the streets, by the modesty laws, for example, right? The laws around begging, right? For lesbian women, for example, there are various kinds of laws that are used in habeas corpus petitions, right? So therefore, there are these other kinds of laws that actually very directly, um, you know, um, persecute the trans and the queer subject, and especially if those who are, Dalit within them get even more persecuted. So therefore, I wouldn't say that there is a, there is a wholesome incorporation at this time. But again, like I said, it varies, because when Article 370, for example, was taken off in Kashmir, there were, people within the political parties that would say that, oh, now we are going to save the queers in Kashmir, right? So there is a very selective incorporation, depending on, what under what conditions the incorporation happens, what kind of political discourse is there, who does it serve. So to say that, the figures have been incorporated or they have not been, both I would move away from both the stands. On the other hand, there are other political parties, belonging to the CPIM, the Congress, who also in their manifestos do incorporate the subject, right? And this is something that I have discussed in another paper on homopopulism. So anyway, that's that apart. So I guess to answer your question again, it's very varied. One has to look into the specifics of inclusion and exclusion, and also not just the state, but within the larger queer and trans population who wants to be included and who does not want to be included. So there are certain figures which directly, say that we do want to be included. So it goes both ways. And then there are many, of course, who say that we do not want to be included. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it gives some leads.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, Professor, when I was going through your book, I just found that the book uses a decolonial lens for looking at the perspective of queer lives and how they have been interacting with the society. So, I was wondering, like, what do you think is the importance of using such a lens, especially when colonialism has affected the Indian society so much and it has imposed a legal and social framework over the Indian society?
Yeah, so when we say that we are hoping to use a decolonial lens by doing this work, we basically mean this in in three ways. One is that that there is a theorist called Walter Menolo who uses this term, helps us to understand how how coloniality works, how colonialism and coloniality works in different places. And and we basically was trying to think whether the term livability could help us understand how people across, sites of different precarious conditions and places of colonial difference, they can talk together, come together, and talk about what makes their lives livable. Now, the point is that the other thing that we were also wondering is that if we look at the ordinary everyday life worlds of people, would that help us to reach some kind of a decolonial understanding? And thirdly, we were also interested in looking at whether whether those lives which fall outside of the outside of the intelligible understanding of legal reform, of juridical political understanding, and so on, whether those ordinary life worlds that can tell us something about about the decolonial frame. Now, the point is that there are two, three things I want to make clear here. That the decolonial lens is a lens in sexuality, queer studies, and in other forms of knowledge as well, but specifically in sexuality and queer studies, which seeks to understand the connection between gender sexual lives and the colonial condition, right? And the colonial condition is again a very broad topic, because that means not just the long histories of empire that has contributed to the to the making of different kinds of queer and trans subjects, through their understanding of the civilizational self, and the other of the civilizational self, but also, in post-colonial contexts where how nation states continue with that, that colonial forms of knowledge and mixing it with contextual, racialized and Brahminical forms of knowledge to further, create or use LGBTQIA subjects for their own ends, right? So therefore, this is the broad political theoretical context within which we were trying to look at the decolonial standpoint. But having said that, and we felt that talking to people, looking at their lives against the colonial logic of juridico-political reform, which leads to, again, backward-forward nations, whether that would help us to interrupt that broader discourse. We don't know if we have been successful in that, but and I'm sure there is lots more, to do this. For example, livability itself is a concept that, that doesn't needs more, critical investigation than what we have outlined here, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I mean, coming back to your question that a decolonial lens, does not mean that one goes back to a pre-colonial kind of past, because that too has its various hierarchies and violence and discrimination. But it does mean that, one needs to question and trace what are the kinds of, colonial logic that helps to um, create certain, gender sexual subjects, both in an earlier historical time as well as in contemporary times, and how does understanding that help to thereby move away from that discursively, as well as hopefully on the ground when one is asking for rights and so on. But you're very right that it is a very difficult project. I mean, we are, when we are on the ground, when we are activists, when we are actually negotiating with the legal framework, when we are actually talking to the courts, when we are talking to the police in the police station with the laws that we have in our hands, it's very, very difficult to, not to sometimes use the colonial logic to actually fight the colonial logic, right? So it's a little complicated. It is there, but one tries to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So, Professor, I think I have two questions. I'll just try to frame them because they come from the same basis of negotiations with law and how it interacts in your book. So, particularly with, let's say, the same-sex marriage coming into place, or the whole idea or the legislations behind it and the negotiations that are going on, do you think law impacts the societal perceptions, like these kind of negotiations which keep going on, they impact the societal perceptions of how queer individuals look at themselves and how their lives become livable? And further, do you think these negotiations are enough? The identification, as you have mentioned in your book, is it enough for them to feel secure in how they live? And have we been able to achieve that till now?
So if I understand your question correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're asking whether, the negotiations with the law help in moving towards a life worth living.
Yeah.
So, and especially in the context of same-sex marriage at this moment also. Have I understood the question correctly?
Yeah.
So, again, the answer is, it's a very dynamic answer, because the point is that when we, in the context of this work, for example, and beyond this work also, so when we speak to our acquaintances, our friends, our, people in the movements, different movement spaces, and so on, as well as people who are not in the movement spaces, but whom we know. And depending on one's, class, caste, geographical position, um, the negotiation with the law will be different or useful. So, for example, let's say, for somebody like me who has a lot of privilege, I can afford to say that, I can stay away from negotiating with the law, right? Um, but let's say for a friend of mine who is, who has been at the receiving end of a lot of physical and psychological violence, and who goes to the police station for some, protection, um, and whose livelihood is at stake, negotiating with the law is very, very important. So the point is, engagement and overall engagement and negotiation with the law is absolutely essential, I think. But the point is, how do we do it, right? Do we just say, and this is what we say in the book, that do we just say that, okay, we just want rights, once we have the rights and then we'll all be fine? No, that's not the point. The point is my life worth living, right? And what is it that makes my life worth living? And what we find is that, law is one aspect of it, or legal reforms rather are one aspect of it. The second point is that as far as the same-sex marriage is concerned, the navigation with the negotiation with that, marriage comes with a lot of perks, and the point is that, this is the question that we keep asking, is that, if I already have the perks, why would I want to get married? Why would I want to strengthen the institution, and take more and more perks if I'm already privileged, right? Um, but we also see that marriage is necessary for those who are very, struggling to make their ends meet at the receiving end of violence. And often marriage, for these queer and trans friends, it would it would provide one way out of that violence. It's not a solution to it, but it's so there would be some, acceptance, and that would help. But at the same time, and I don't know if you've seen the press release that has been released yesterday, um, press release regarding, consultation that had gone on. And what we are clearly saying, what the a large section of the significant section, it's not the only section, but many, people are saying, many groups are saying that, look, we can't just talk about same-sex marriage, because same-sex marriage brings in a lot of privilege. But we also have to understand that it is necessary for some people who are at the receiving end of violence. And therefore, we have to highlight the kinds of natal family violence that people face, which necessarily does not get resolved by legal reforms.
Thank you so much for these insights, Professor. So, while I was reading your book, so your book has somewhere highlighted that there is a global north perception of progress, which is leading this whole gender inclusion movement. But the problem with this global north perception of progress is that it perceives or it portrays global south as something which is regressive or which is backward. Whereas if we look at the ancient literature or we look at the ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, they have been recognizing homosexuality and somewhere they have been respecting this also. So should we reshape this whole notion of progress so that this idea of a regressive global south can be deconstructed?
Well, I think what we are trying to suggest through this book is that the progress backward because if I'm putting somebody as progressive, I have to put somebody as backward. I cannot just say progressive and reconfigure the narrative of progress, because even if I need reconfigure the narrative of progress, somebody else has to be backward. Otherwise, the term progress does not make any sense. So I think what we're trying to push, to push people to think about is that, can we do away with the progress backward narrative at all? Because it is very much steeped in a, colonial logic. And therefore, can we do away with that progress backward narrative? The second point is that going back to, pre-colonial times, to one's indigenous histories, it depends whose indigenous histories, right? So, for example, if we are going back to indigenous histories in our context, we will see that a lot of it is steeped in a Brahminical past, right? And which continues to the present. So therefore, we may very well say that, okay, women and that, relationships that did not necessarily conform to what we know as heterosexual relationships today were more respected. Probably they were, who knows, there were some forms of excess. Yes, we cannot label them. There were some forms of excess. There was some kind of toleration. Yes. But the question itself is, is we have to ask, is it a relevant question? Because if we pick those instances up and say that, let's, put them as models, that, okay, let's go back to a pre-colonial past, we have it in our culture, what purpose does it serve? Because that culture is a very Brahminical culture. So we can't just pick one thing out of it and then say that, let's, it doesn't make any sense. So it's best to just, look at, basically, try to look away, because the past, clearly, pre-colonial past was not progressive either. It was deeply steeped in a Brahminical, and still is in a Brahminical culture. So it does not make any sense. So therefore, any kind of, colonial logic, any kind of Brahminical culture, irrespective of whether they are perhaps at some point, respecting the queer trans subject or not, becomes irrelevant. I mean, the entire exclusion of the queer trans subject, we have to understand how that exclusion is also related to the establishment of, of a white culture, of a colonial culture, of a Brahminical culture, and so on. So we cannot take that away from the larger system. So no, I would not go back to our indigenous, to our past. But yes, if one is talking about certain, Dalit Adivasi pasts, to Native American pasts, to African American pasts, and looking at, what there, what from that standpoint, what can we retrieve, which may be useful to bring about, acceptance of gender sexual minorities. That is a thing I would be interested in.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I think so we'll have to restart the meeting because it's about to end. So
Okay.
yeah, so we'll join again on the same link. I'm just ending this
Okay.
meeting.
Right. So continuing from where we left off, Professor, so your research method, when we were going through it, one thing that stood out to us was the idea of conducting interviews in both the countries, or with people who belong to both the cultures. One thing that keeps popping up is, how do they interpret how life is livable differently in both the countries, and how their experiences have kind of formed the shape of your book, and how do you interpret it?
Yeah, so so the interesting thing is that methodologically, we had different kinds of um, modalities to to do research for this work, and which included both focus group discussions, we don't call them focus group discussions, but they were similar to that. We call them workshops. We did actually detailed workshops, and then we also did in-depth interviews. We did street theaters. We had online surveys, um, and so one of the things that we found is that we kind of played many of these conversations against each other, not against, but juxtaposed them together. And when we juxtaposed them, we saw that that legal reforms are do not actually necessarily directly related to making one's life livable. I mean, they have some influence, but they do not. They cannot be. It's there's no cause and effect like that. That I'll have legal reform and so therefore my life will be livable. No, there are many other things other than legal reforms. So I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Um,
It was about how, with the diverse set of candidates that you had for interviewing through your different methods,
Mhm.
how did it come to shape the way that you actually formed the actual thesis of your book, or how you wrote the book?
Right. Right. So this, having those different conversations, having those different workshops, for for an almost an entire across an entire year, um, we saw that these conversations actually busted that myth that legal reforms make people's lives livable, and absence of legal reforms makes people's lives unlivable. So somewhere, we kind of given our embeddedness in our own communities, and communities of alliances, kinships, etc., we kind of knew that, but we did not have an in-depth understanding of that before we wrote this book. So and there were very similar, often there were very similar concerns between people both that we spoke to in the UK and in West Bengal, where, for example, very simple things like facing discriminatory statements in their workplace. So just because somewhere in England there was a law doesn't mean that um, people there LGBTQIA identifying would not face discriminatory remarks in their workplace. Um, so there were many similar experiences, but there were different experiences also, and not all of them were related to the absence or presence of legal reforms. It is this that we set out to do, which I think hopefully we did that. Yeah.
Just one follow-up, Professor. Do you think the idea behind the foundation that law impacts positively or negatively the lives of queer individuals, do you think having that in the back of your mind made your research a little narrower than it should have been, or did it help it become a little more broad? That would be helpful to understand, I think.
So since our focus was on the absence or presence of legal reform, and whether an absence of presence of legal reform is directly related to livability or unlivability, that was a very specific question. And therefore, since that specific, we just had this one question, that is it. And therefore, in that sense, of course, it is a very particular, specific, narrow, space, that there was just one question, that is it. But then, when we spoke to people, asked them what makes their life livable, and I have to say this here also, and I'm sure you've noticed that in the book, that translating the term in West Bengal and, looking at the variety of the term in West Bengal, um, And so just because Judith Butler talked about livability doesn't mean that people were not thinking about livability, right? So what is it that one finds when, what are the terms that people use to make their life worth living? And how does that speak back to the concepts that we have? So people live their lives. People live their lives irrespective of whether legal reforms exist or not. What are those lives, right? So we found a lot of variety there. The kind of aspirations, the kind of discriminations, the kind of violence, the kind of compromises, that was very varied, which of course did not, conform to the narrow question that we had when we set out.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was all from our side. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us. We enjoyed it thoroughly, and it was really, really interesting to actually read your book. Thankfully, we have access to Bloomsbury collection, so we could go through it easily. And we are hoping that we get to have more discussions about you on queer identities and their discourse in the future. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. And I hope that, that's why we made it open access so that more and more people can read it, and not
Yeah.
just read, but actually also, productively critique it, move beyond it, do whatever they want to do with it. So that we also keep learning from how people look at it, interpret it, and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.